Australia's government just got grilled for its reckless housing policies by the world's biggest international financial institution, and it cannot get more humiliating than this. We are now at the point where global watchdogs are stepping in to tell this government that it has messed up. And somehow, the people in charge are still walking around like everything is fine. Hey guys, it's Scott here. Now, not too long ago, I did a video on how an international body called the OECD openly condemned the Australian government for reckless spending, rising deficits, and a lazy tax system that leans way too hard on income taxes, while Aussies are getting smashed with the cost of living and also around housing supply, and we need to fix our housing supply numbers. That was already an international embarrassment. That should have been the wake-up call. It clearly was not. And now the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has released a full report dissecting the government's housing policies, tax settings, spending decisions, and economic direction. And they basically say this is not good enough and Aussies will suffer for it if we do not make changes. Basically, they have totally roasted the Australian government on their financial mismanagement. So guys, this is the IMF. It is one of the two biggest financial institutions on the planet, alongside the World Bank. When the IMF speaks, global markets listen. They run some of the largest macroeconomic models in the world. So my question is simple. How badly do you have to mess up for the IMF to publicly roast you and call you out on your economic and housing policies? And what will it actually take for this government to wake up before it is too late and an entire generation is locked out of the housing market for good? Now, in this video, I'm going to break down exactly what the IMF said, what it criticized, how the government tried to defend itself, and what the IMF is recommending next, and what all of this means for you and your future. And before we get into it, I do this every single day: property, the economy, government policy. So hit subscribe, hit the bell icon. Let's get into it. So let's start with what actually happened in the report and what was being criticized. The IMF has just completed its full health check on the Australian economy, known as its Article IV consultation, and inside that review, they took direct aim at the government's 5% deposit scheme. This is the same scheme the government has been celebrating like it is the lifeboat first-home buyers needed, like it is the magic shortcut to affordability, like they solved housing with one announcement, one policy, and a bit of a grin. But the IMF said the complete opposite to that. They said this scheme will contribute to near-term price pressure. This will push prices up in the immediate term. This is a polite way of saying you just drag demand forward into a supply-starved market and then acted surprised when prices kept moving. And it is not like this warning came out of nowhere either, because economists and housing analysts have been yelling this exact point for a very long time. The 5% deposit scheme will make affordability much worse. Then the IMF goes one level deeper and basically said Australia does not need more demand-side gimmicks right now. Australia needs a holistic top-level strategy that actually increases property supply, because demand is already hot and migration keeps adding more pressure. So if you keep juicing demand without fixing supply properly, you are literally pouring fuel on the fire of price growth. And then the IMF even floated a very specific change. They said the government should consider limiting the guarantee program to the purchase of new dwellings, newly constructed dwellings. Because at least then, you are not just beating up the existing stock, you are actually putting demand into the construction of new stock and adding to supply. Here is the part that should make you sit up. The IMF put hard numbers on how cooked affordability has become. They flagged that housing affordability has deteriorated so much that new mortgages are taking around 47% of median household income, rents are chewing up around 24%, and it can roughly take 11 years to save for a 20% deposit. If you can look at those numbers and still say housing is fine, you're either lying or you have never paid a bill in your life. And they also pointed out that housing completions are nowhere near the pace required to hit the 1.2 million homes target by 2029. We already know, and the government has actually revised that number down to about 950,000. Now, this means the supply gap is widening, not closing. So that is the IMF's starting position. The government's flagship affordability scheme pushes prices up, while the supply of new housing is not keeping up, and Aussies are getting crushed. Now the story gets even more infuriating because when the government was challenged on this, the response was not accountability, it was more spin. So what did the government do when the IMF just publicly roasted them on their housing strategy? They tried to wave it away with Treasury modeling. Now, the Housing Minister's office pointed to Treasury modeling that claims the expanded 5% deposit scheme would only have a minor impact on prices, something like a 0.6% price impact over 6 years. 6 years, so let me get this absolutely straight. The whole controversy is about pulling demand forward now, in a market that is already tight now, with first-time buyers competing now, and the defense is a model that looks over 6 years and tries to make the short-term pain disappear into the long-term average. Here is the problem. Treasury documents reported in the media have indicated the short-term effects were never modeled in the first place. It was never done, which is exactly the part everyone actually cares about when prices are running and affordability is already broken. And by the way, guys, this is complete BS because of course they modeled it, but was it hidden? Was it pushed away? Was it redacted? So the government's defense is basically, do not worry, our model says it is fine, while the IMF is saying this is contributing to price pressure now, and the property market data has been showing stronger price growth in the affordable segment of the property market that this scheme targets. That is why this whole thing feels so dishonest, because if this policy was truly harmless, the government would not need to hide behind selective timeframes, and they would not need to keep acting shocked when critics say, you are inflating demand. The IMF did not just criticize the government, it basically handed them a step-by-step framework to clean up this mess, because clearly it does not trust them to figure it out on their own. And when you hear what the IMF is recommending, you will realize something. These are not magic solutions. These are basic economic fixes that Aussies and economists have been screaming for years. So guys, this is basic economics. This is housing 101. It doesn't get any more simple than this. The IMF is saying stop leaning on demand side policies that pull purchases forward and push prices higher, and start implementing supply boosting reforms that actually make it easier to build, faster to approve, and more realistic to deliver housing at scale. This means zoning. It means planning approvals fast. It means to look at our building restrictions. It means speeding up development pathways so supply can respond. It means incentivizing the purchase of new property instead of getting strangled by red tape while politicians brag about unrealistic targets they cannot hit. They also raised tax reform as part of a broader approach, including discussion around investor-focused concessions and the capital gains tax discount, and they pointed to inefficient taxes like stamp duty as part of the problem because it locks people in place and clogs the whole housing system. Now, you might agree or disagree with specific tax levers, but the point is this. The IMF is pushing the government towards structural reform, not just shiny PR-focused bonuses. And that is exactly what so many economists, analysts, and honestly, so many everyday Aussies have been saying for years. You've been telling me this in the comments. So the frustrating question becomes, why did it take international pressure for the government to even be forced into this conversation properly? And why does it always feel like Aussies have to suffer first before anyone admits the obvious? Because while the government debates economic modeling and deflects criticism, the damage is happening in real time to real households. Which brings us to the only part that actually matters. What does this mean for you? Okay, so let's connect the dots here. When the IMF says a flagship first-home buyer scheme will push prices up, that is not a debate, but a reflection of what is happening on the ground. That is first-home buyers being forced to borrow more. That is renters watching the entry-level market stay hot. That is families needing bigger deposits, bigger loans, and bigger repayments. When the IMF says completions are not keeping up with what Australia needs, that means the shortage stays locked in and the pressure will stay in the system for years. When the IMF has to publicly recommend basic supply reform, it tells you the government is not moving fast enough, and it tells you that no one is coming to rescue affordability with a magic announcement. This leads to one thing: property prices here in Australia will double in the next 10 years. So if you are sitting there hoping the government is about to fix housing with one brilliant move, think again. If you're waiting for homes to become more affordable so that you can get into the market, think again. If you're holding back on purchasing right now or investing right now, it may be the worst decision you ever make because the incentives do not line up. The execution has been weak and the outcomes keep getting worse, which means you have to treat this like reality, not a press conference. You have to protect your own household. You have to plan your own buffers. You have to stop assuming policy is going to save you because right now policy is actually part of the problem. In fact, it is the core problem. So that is what the IMF report really exposed. If you were hoping someone in government was about to roll out a magic fix for the housing crisis to slow down housing price growth, think again, because this looks like a government that keeps learning the lesson after the damage is already done. As this government continues to get it wrong, they do not pay the price, you do. You pay it through higher rents, higher mortgage repayments, higher taxes, and higher bills. Thanks guys, this was your daily property update. I break down property, the economy, and government policy every single day with no spin. If you want to stay ahead of what's really happening in this country, hit subscribe, hit the bell icon to stay informed. I'll see you at the next video.